In the baked-out gut of Red Canyon, a dying lioness lay draped over her two cubs, eyes clouded, claws buried in the sand. Just a few yards away, an unarmed ranger stood inside her killing radius, knowing he wouldn't outrun her if she came. In the last seconds of her strength, she had to choose: tear the intruder apart, or trust him enough to hand over everything she had left, her cub's future. The desert light in Red Canyon had a way of bleaching the world down to bone and memory. That afternoon, it pressed straight down from a white-hot sky, flattening every shadow, baking every stone. Heat shimmered over the red rock walls and the cracked earth like breath from an open oven, swallowing sound and color until almost nothing moved, almost. She lay there in the middle of it, a patch of tawny fur against the rust-red dust. Aurora, the lioness they had rescued years ago from a concrete pen and given a new life in this wild corner of the Southwest. Now her ribs showed under her hide like the slats of an old fence, each breath a shallow rise that seemed to cost more than it gave. Two tiny bodies were wedged tight against her belly, hidden under the fold of her foreleg. The cubs. Their ears twitched, their little sides trembled. One of them let out a thin, rasping cry, and nosed blindly at her, searching for milk that wasn't there anymore. The sound was so small it barely rose above the whisper of hot wind, but it reached the man standing just a few yards away like a splinter in his heart. Jack Turner stopped where the sand turned darker with her shadow, boots sinking half an inch into the powdery soil. His hat brim was damp with sweat, his shirt clinging to the curve of his back. At 52, he wasn't supposed to be this close to danger without backup, not in this heat, not with his knees reminding him every morning that he was past the age when most men started talking about retirement savings and which Medicare plan they might have to wrestle with next. He had spent a lifetime running toward fires and emergencies while other people ran away. Tonight, he had told himself on the drive out, was going to be different. Tonight, he was just going to check a GPS collar, log a few notes, and go home. But nothing about the scene in front of him looked like something you could just log and walk away from. Aurora's head lay on its side, her muzzle streaked with dust, her tongue just visible between cracked black lips. Her eyes were half open, dull amber, clouded over by exhaustion and a kind of resigned pain Jack had seen before in burn victims who had waited too long for help. Each breath rattled, then paused as if the air didn't want to go back inside her. The cubs shifted again. One tiny paw slipped out from under her foreleg, claws no bigger than toothpicks flexing weakly at the empty air. It made Jack think about the old folks in town on fixed income, stretching every dollar, skipping prescriptions because the health insurance paperwork was too confusing, trying to make something out of nothing. That same quiet desperation lived in the cub's thin cry. He knew how close he was. He knew exactly what they called this distance in the training manuals: the killing radius. 15 feet. Close enough that if the lioness found one last burst of strength, she could cross it before he could even raise his hands. He had left his tranquilizer rifle back by the truck, where the rules said it should stay until he had explicit clearance. Out here, it was just his boots, his breath, and the animal lying in the dust. Aurora's eyes moved first. It was a small thing, a slow drag of her gaze from the blank sky down to the shape of the man. She didn't lift her head. She didn't have to. That look found him and held him the way a hand finds a shoulder in the dark. Jack felt it slide over his chest, down his arms to his fingertips. He did what he'd been taught years ago, long before life insurance ads and home insurance premiums started showing up in his mail like clockwork. He turned his body slightly sideways, making himself a little smaller. He kept his hands where she could see them, low and empty. He dropped his eyes, not out of fear, but out of respect. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from too many miles of dusty roads and too many late-night coffees. "I see you." The wind chose that moment to sweep across the hollow, lifting a curtain of dust, brushing the stiff grass and the dry bones of something that hadn't survived the drought. It carried the smell of old blood, of sun-baked fur, of the slow rot of a land that had forgotten what rain felt like. Somewhere far off, a crow called once and fell silent. Aurora's nostrils flared, tasting him. Her pupils tightened just a little. Jack didn't move. Up close he could see how thin she was, the hollows where muscle should have been. Her flanks rose and fell in uneven rhythm, each breath a small struggle. He knew enough about biology to understand what that meant. Her body was already spending itself, dipping into reserves that were almost gone. She tried to lift her head. The effort sent a visible shudder through her shoulders. Her foreleg tightened over the cubs, pulling them closer under her chest. A low sound began somewhere deep in her throat, barely a growl, more like the scrape of a stone over another stone. The sound rolled through the dry air and settled into Jack's bones. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You've got every right." The cub nearest to him let out another cry, higher this time, more frantic. It wriggled and pushed against its mother's ribs, nose smeared with dust as it pawed at her belly. Aurora's ear twitched. Her gaze broke away from Jack and dropped down to the restless movement under her. He saw it happen, that tiny shift of attention, away from the threat, back to the reason she was still breathing. Jack swallowed. His throat felt as dry as the cracked earth under his boots. Somewhere, behind him, beyond the line of scrub and low rock, his truck sat in the sun, safe and sensible, with a radio that could call in more help, more rules, more delays. Somewhere on his kitchen table at home lay a stack of unopened mail, property tax notices, and health insurance brochures, and reminders that life was supposed to be predictable if you just followed the guidelines. Out here, there were no guidelines for this. He took one slow step closer, then another, feeling the ground give a little under his weight, listening for any sharp intake of breath from the lioness. At 10 feet, he could see the flies crawling at the corners of her eyes, the thin crust of salt where tears had dried on her fur. At 8 feet, he heard something else, a faint rustle, a whisper of bodies moving over stone somewhere beyond the ridge. Coyotes, maybe, or something worse. The desert was full of things that waited for a moment of weakness. Aurora heard it too. Her ears flicked toward the sound, then flattened again. That low, broken growl rose one notch higher. Her paw flexed over the cubs. The muscles in her shoulders bunched and trembled. She was running on fumes now, but there was enough left in the tank for one last choice. Jack could see it on her face, in the way her lips lifted to show a line of dull, worn teeth. If she came at him, she wouldn't do much damage. Maybe she wouldn't even reach him before her legs gave out. But she didn't know that. In her mind, in whatever flickering place inside her still measured danger and possibility, he was only one thing, the intruder who had crossed the invisible line around her babies. He stopped. The heat pressed down on the back of his neck. Sweat slid down his spine. Time seemed to lean in, listening. "Listen," he said softly, and he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. "You don't owe me anything, not a thing. I'm the one who walked in here." Another thin cry from the cubs muffled under her leg. He watched the battle happening in the small details of her body, the twitch of a whisker, the quiver of a muscle along her jaw. Her throat worked as if she was swallowing a stone. The foreleg over the cubs tightened, then loosened, then tightened again. Back in the city, years ago, he had stood in a burning apartment hallway with smoke thick as wool and a radio in his ear saying, "Hold, Turner, wait for confirmation." He had waited, just long enough for the ceiling to come down and take his best friend with it. Since then, the word wait had tasted like ash in his mouth. Now there was no radio, no chief, no insurance company, no policy manual, just the lioness, the cubs, and the seconds stretching out between them. Aurora gathered what was left of herself. Her claws dug into the dust. Her head came up an inch, then another, eyes locked on Jack's face. The world around them, the dry wind, the circling crow, the far-off scurry of other predators, fell away. In the last seconds of her strength, the dying lioness had to choose: attack the man who had crossed into her circle, or give him the only thing she had left to protect, her cubs. 10 days before Jack stood inside the killing radius, Red Canyon had already begun to feel like a place the sky had abandoned. The last real rain anyone remembered had come and gone more than 2 months earlier, a thin gray curtain that barely settled the dust before the sun took it back. Since then, every morning rose bright and empty, and every evening went down over land a little more stripped, a little more tired. From the ridge above the reserve, you could see how the drought had eaten its way through the valley. The creek that once braided silver through the bottom lay in a dull, cracked ribbon, its stones exposed and bleached. The small holding ponds that used to shimmer like coins were now just bowls of caked mud veined with fractures. A few thorn bushes clung to the edges, their leaves curled in tight, grudging fists. Jack remembered when they first drove Aurora into this place, years back, wedged in a crate that smelled like old bleach and fear. She had come from a roadside menagerie halfway across the country: steel bars, concrete floors, tourists throwing popcorn and cheap hot dogs. The kind of place where you saw more signs for car insurance and discount credit cards than you did grass. He had watched her step out of the crate into real dirt for the first time, blinking against the harsh light, overly cautious on her paws. She had shaken herself then, sending a cloud of dust and loose hair into the air, and let out a roar that bounced off the canyon walls and made everyone grin at once. Now the dust was back, but the joy was gone. The heat settled early that day, sliding in even as the thin light crept over the eastern cliffs. Jack sat at his worn metal desk in the office trailer, the old air conditioner humming and rattling above him, doing its best to pretend it was younger. On the wall, the GPS monitor glowed faint green and yellow. Blips marked collars on elk, bighorn sheep, coyotes, and the 3 lions they tracked in the reserve. Aurora's dot, labeled L003, had hardly moved in the last 24 hours. He cradled a chipped mug of coffee and rubbed the back of his neck. Outside the trailer window, the parking lot shimmered. The radio on the shelf was low, some local station talking about rising mortgage rates and retirement savings, easing into another ad about Medicare plans and life insurance. Someone somewhere wanted people his age to sit down with a financial advisor, plan for the gentle slope into the golden years. Jack glanced at the GPS screen again and thought about how little in his life had ever gone according to plan. The door banged open and a gust of hot air followed Riley Grant inside. The younger ranger brushed dust off his uniform shirt, cheeks flushed from the short walk from the truck. "Morning," Riley said, dropping a folder on the desk. Fence line on the north side still holding. Few pronghorn tracks near the boundary, but they turned back. Smart ones. Jack nodded, eyes sliding back to L03's stubborn little dot. "She's still barely moving." "You sure the collar's not acting up?" Riley asked. "Batteries on those things are older than my student loans." "Signal's steady," Jack said. "If it were dying, we'd see it fade, jump. This looks deliberate, or she's down." Riley leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the screen. "Could be she found some shade and decided to sit tight. If I had a fur coat in this, I'd do the same." Jack didn't answer. 24 hours in one spot wouldn't have worried him too much. 48 started to feel like a story with a bad ending. The radio on the table crackled, then cleared. A woman's voice came through, steady, calm, with the faint clipped edge of someone who spent a lot of time explaining things to people who didn't want to hear them. "Jack, you there? It's Maya." He picked up the mic. "Yeah, I'm here." "Got the overnight report," Dr. Maya Collins said. No new fires in the region, no reports of sick animals from the highway patrol or the ranchers. How's our collarboard look? Jack's eyes never left Aurora's dot. L03's been sitting in the same wash for 2 days now, maybe a couple of yards in any direction, tops. Maya was quiet for a moment. She could be sheltering from the heat. That wash has some overhang. We saw it on survey last spring. Could be, Jack said, or she could be on her last legs, hard to tell from a blinking light. We can't chase every collar that takes a nap, Maya replied. You know that. We don't have the staff, and we don't have the money. Half our donors are already asking why we're not investing more in online education and less in field work. And the state keeps reminding me about budget deficits and health insurance for seasonal staff. Jack could picture her in the small lab at the other end of the compound, dark hair pulled back, glasses sliding down her nose as she frowned at some spreadsheet with more red numbers than black. She had the kind of mind that loved patterns and long-term trends, the kind of person who could talk for an hour about climate data or sustainable agriculture. He respected that. But sometimes data felt cold when you'd seen as many dead things on the ground as he had. We're not talking about chasing every nap, he said quietly. We're talking about a lioness with 2 cubs in the middle of the worst drought we've had since this place was a mining camp. She goes down, they go with her. Before Maya could answer, tires crunched on gravel outside. Another door opened and closed. The office trailer shifted slightly as someone heavy-footed climbed the steps. The knob turned without a knock, and Lucas Briggs filled the doorway, hat in hand, face lined, from years of squinting into sun and worry. Morning, Lucas said, tipping his hat more out of habit than cheer. Lucas, Jack replied, you're up early. Cows don't sleep in, the rancher said. He smelled like leather, dust, and the faint sharp note of hay. Neither do bank payments. He stepped inside, nodding at Riley, then looked around as if expecting to see the drought itself sitting in a chair. His gaze settled on the GPS monitor. That one there, he said, jabbing a finger toward the glowing cluster. That your lion? One of them, Jack said. Aurora. Well, Aurora and her friends been getting closer to my north pasture, Lucas said. Fence lines are dry, creek beds gone. My cattle walk a mile farther every day just to find a puddle. You know what happens when water goes scarce. Everything starts pushing into everything else. Jack had heard the worry under the words before, rising feed prices, veterinary bills, farm insurance premiums that went up every year, and now the land itself turning against them. It wasn't just wildlife fighting to survive here. We're watching her, Jack said. She's not in your pasture. Yet, Lucas said. Look, I'm not here to pick a fight. I know this place brings in tourists and college kids and grant money. I know the videos you folks put online help people learn, maybe even donate. But if that lion gets desperate and takes one of my calves, the state's going to call her a problem animal. And you know what happens to problem animals in this county. His meaning hung between them like heat. Maya's voice drifted out of the radio again, tinny but firm. We're not at that point, Lucas. The collars show all 3 lions inside the reserve. The drought's hard on everyone. We're monitoring. Monitoring, Lucas said, rolling the word around like a pebble in his mouth. I got grandkids, Jack. I got a wife who handles our bills and worries every time I ride fence alone. I'm already behind on the loan from last spring. I can't afford to lose stock on top of it, and then find out the insurance don't want to pay because they say I didn't do enough to keep predators out. Jack looked from Lucas to the screen, to Aurora's stubborn little dot glowing in the same dry wash. 2 families, he thought, one with cows and grandkids and bankers, one with claws and 2 tiny mouths pressed against a rib cage. We'll keep an eye on her, he said. If something changes, you'll hear from me before you hear it from town gossip. That's the best I can promise today. Lucas studied his face, then nodded slowly. I'll hold you to that, Turner. I don't want no trouble. I just want to make it through this year with my herd and my home still mine." He left, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Jack lifted the radio again. "Maya, if L03's still not moving by tomorrow morning, I'm going out there. At least to take a look. I can't sit in here while a mother and 2 cubs turn into 3 more sets of bones in the wash." There was another stretch of silence on the line, filled with the distant buzz of static and the hum of the old air conditioner. When Maya finally spoke, her voice was softer. "Log the data today," she said. "Send me your notes. We'll talk after evening rounds." The channel clicked off. Jack set the mic down and stared at the blinking light on the screen. Out in the canyon, under a sky that seemed to have forgotten how to weep, a lioness was holding still in one lonely spot. He didn't know yet that in just a few days he would stand within reach of her claws and her choice. All he knew now was that the desert was running out of time. And so was she. By the time the sun slid down behind the canyon walls that night, the little green light on the GPS board had become more than a blinking dot to Jack. It felt like an accusation. He sat alone in the office trailer, the sky outside the small window shifting from orange to purple to the deep, dry blue of a desert night. The air conditioner groaned as it fought the lingering heat, rattling in the thin wall like an old truck on a washboard road. On the desk in front of him, the screen glowed softly, a simple map of Red Canyon with its scattered electronic signatures. Elk, bighorn, coyotes, the other 2 lions. They all drifted like slow fireflies across the screen. But L03, Aurora, was still anchored to the same patch of wash at the bottom of a narrow gully. 24 hours. 36. Now pushing toward 48. Jack rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. When he looked again, the dot hadn't budged. The door opened with a squeak and a gust of cooler air. Jonah slipped in, carefully closing it behind him as if he were afraid of startling something. "Hey," the younger man said, "you still here?" "Last I checked," Jack replied. "Thought you went back to the bunkhouse." Jonah shook his head and held up a camera by its strap. "I was up on the observation deck, trying to get some night shots. You can see the stars real good on a night like this. Looks like somebody spilled diamonds over the whole sky." Jack managed the faintest smile. That had been one of the first things that drew him out here, too, before he'd known all the ways a sky like that could watch over suffering. "Yeah," he said. "They sell travel insurance in town for folks who drive out here just to look at those stars. Nobody insures the things that live under them, though." Jonah came closer to the desk, eyes going straight to the screen. "She still hasn't moved?" "Nope." Jack tapped the display. "Same wash, same coordinates. She might be shifting a few feet here and there, but the collar's treating it like one big, long nap." "Maybe it's glitching," Jonah offered. "My phone freezes sometimes if I've got too many apps open. Maybe her. Collars like that. Old software." "If that collar's frozen," Jack said, "it picked a mighty convenient time to do it. Right when the land went dry and the prey disappeared." Jonah leaned in, studying the little cluster of lines that represented the dry channel. "I filmed down there last spring. When the snowmelt came through, that whole wash was full. There was this one spot where the water pooled under a rock shelf. Looked like a motel for deer. All you could eat and shade included." "Not anymore," Jack said. "Now it's a graveyard waiting to happen." The radio on the shelf clicked as it picked up a new signal. An announcer's voice drifted through, smooth and practiced, sliding into another commercial break between the late-night talk. "You've worked hard your whole life. Make sure your family is protected with the right life insurance and retirement planning. Call today to compare Medicare plans, home insurance, and car insurance options that fit your budget." Jonah rolled his eyes and reached over to turn the volume down. "Those ads follow me like a stray dog," he muttered. "I watched one video about saving money, and now my feed thinks I'm 80. Jack huffed softly. "You get to 80, you'll be glad somebody reminded you," he said. "Assuming we don't cook ourselves off this planet first." He picked up the microphone and thumbed the call button. "Maya, you on?" Static crackled, then cleared. "I'm here," Dr. Collins answered. Her voice sounded tired around the edges, like someone who had spent the day arguing with spreadsheets and weather reports. "What's our board look like?" "Everybody's moving except L03, Jack said. "Coming up on 2 full days. Nothing but a little jitter in place. She's in that narrow wash just south of Needle Rock. You remember the one?" "I remember," Maya said slowly. "Any sign of interference? Spikes? Drops?" "Signal's clean," Jack replied. "I can check the tower logs again, but it looks solid. If that collar's lying, it's doing a damn good impression of the truth." Jonah shifted his weight, bouncing the camera strap against his chest. "I could go up on the deck again," he offered. "Zoom in, see if I can catch something. Even at night, the infrared picks up movement. Might be grainy, but it's better than a blinking light." "Do it," Jack said, covering the mic with his hand. "Take the tripod, steady as you can." Jonah nodded and slipped back out into the night, the door closing quickly behind him to keep the cool in. Maya's voice came through again, softer now. "Jack, you know we can't respond to every stationary caller. We'd be chasing ghosts all over the reserve. We don't have the staff, or the funding, or, frankly, the backing from the board. They're already on me about budget cuts. I spent half my afternoon talking to some consultant about digital outreach, opportunities, and passive income streams instead of water trucks and hay." "I've heard the pitch," Jack said. "Seems like everybody these days wants us to sell T-shirts and subscription content. Nobody wants to pay for diesel and field med kits." "We have to pick our battles," Maya said. "That's just the reality. Climate change, drought, politics, the cost of feeding our own team." "Maya," Jack interrupted quietly, "this battle picked us. You put a collar on that lioness. You named her L03 in your notes. But out here, we call her Aurora. We watched her learn this land. We watched her have those cubs. Now, her dot's stuck in a dry wash with no water and no shade big enough to hide in. She doesn't fit in a line item on a budget spreadsheet. She fits right there." He tapped the glowing dot again, harder this time. On the other end of the line, there was a long exhale. "You think she's down?" "I think," Jack said slowly, "that if we wait until we're sure she's down, we'll be rolling up 3 carcasses instead of asking ourselves if we could have done something." Static ticked in the background, like distant rain that never came. "If we go out," Maya said, "we have to do it by the book. No feeding, no water, no drugs, unless there's clear evidence of entanglement or injury that affects the whole population. The board can pull our permits if they think we're turning this into a petting zoo. You know how fast public opinion turns when people on the internet decide you're meddling with nature." Jack thought about that, about the way a single shaky video could spread faster than a grass fire, about comment sections full of strangers arguing about things they'd never smelled or touched. He also thought about the way Aurora's ribs had shown under her skin the last time he'd seen her through binoculars. "So we go look," he said. "We take a jeep, we keep our distance, we log what we see. If she's sunning herself like a house cat on a porch, fine. I'll write the report and buy you a coffee. If she's on her side with 2 cubs on her belly and flies in her eyes, we'll cross the next bridge when we get to it. But I can't sit here and watch that dot not move and pretend it doesn't mean something." Another pause, then, "All right," Maya said. "First light. You and Riley take Unit 2. Tiejo. Jonah can ride along with the camera, but only as an observer. No posting, no streaming, nothing goes online without review. You keep the tranquilizer rifle in the truck unless we see a direct threat to human life." "And Jack?" Yeah? We're going to look, she said. Not to intervene, not yet. You understand that. He understood it the way a man understands a speed limit sign on an empty highway. He understood what the word said and what his gut argued with. I hear you, he answered. When he set the mic down, the office felt smaller. The hum of the yacht. Air conditioner seemed louder. Outside the window, the night had deepened, the sky full of stars that didn't care about rules or budgets or blinking lights on a screen. The door opened once more. Jonah stuck his head in, cheeks flushed from the climb. I zoomed all the way in, he said. Couldn't see much detail, just a shape in the wash that's too big to be one animal alone. Looks like a lump with, I don't know, smaller lumps tucked up against it. No movement I could catch, but the heat shimmer makes everything dance. Jack nodded slowly. A lioness and 2 cubs huddled in a dry gully under a sky that refused to help. Get some sleep, he told Jonah. We roll out at dawn. As the younger man left, Jack turned back to the monitor one last time. L03's dot sat where it had all day, all night, steady and stubborn. In a few hours he would see what that stillness meant. He didn't know yet that standing over that dot in the dust, he would step straight into the circle where a dying lioness had only seconds left to decide who she was and who he was going to be. Dawn came in slow and colorless, a pale wash over the jagged horizon as if the sky was too tired to bother with a sunrise. Jack stood by Unit 2 in the gravel lot, steam from his coffee rising in little curls that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. The pickup's white paint was dulled by dust and years of sun. The state logo on the door faded to a ghost of itself. Riley checked the tires with the toe of his boot, then walked around to the rifle rack and lifted the tranquilizer gun with both hands. He handled it the way some folks handle their retirement paperwork or a health insurance policy. Carefully, with a kind of wary respect. Necessary, but not something you ever wanted to use. Darts are loaded, he said. Safety's on. You sure we're going to need this? I hope we don't, Jack answered, but hope isn't a plan. Jonah jogged up, backpack slung over one shoulder, camera case bouncing against his hip, his hair stuck up on one side, sleep still hanging on him. Sorry, he puffed. Alarm went off and I thought it was my student loan app reminding me I'm broke again. Hit snooze by reflex. Jack almost smiled. You're here. That's what counts. Get in. We want to be at the wash before the heat gets ideas. They climbed in, Jonah wedged in the middle between Jack and Riley, knees knocking against the dashboard. Jack turned the key. The engine coughed, then settled into a steady rumble. As they rolled out of the lot, the radio crackled to life with the morning news. Talk of rising mortgage rates, home insurance premiums in wildfire country, and a commercial for some national company promising better car insurance if you just made one phone call. Jack turned the volume down. Out here, there were bigger risks than fender benders. The road to the South Wash was more suggestion than pavement, a narrow thread of packed dirt that wound between scrub and rock. As they left the last of the buildings behind, Red Canyon spread out around them like a forgotten painting. The dry creek bed was a gray scar on the land, snaking through low hills bleached almost white. Cottonwoods that once marked water now stood like gray skeletons, their branches bare. Looks worse than last week, Riley muttered, staring out the window. Didn't think that was possible. Jonah lifted his camera, pressing it against the glass to catch the way the early light threw long blue shadows behind every stone. People on the internet think deserts are always romantic, he said softly. Sunsets and campfires and vacation packages with travel insurance included. They never show this part. This is the part the animals remember, Jack replied. As they dipped into a shallow valley, the air grew stiller, heavier. The truck's tires crunched over something that didn't sound like gravel. Jack eased off the gas and looked down. Bones. Not whole skeletons, just scattered pieces, ribs, vertebrae, the long, clean arc of a leg bone, half buried in dust. Antelope, Riley said quietly. Maybe deer. Hard to tell now. They saw more as they went, sun-bleached pieces of what had once run, grazed, breathed. Here and there, a skull watched them with empty sockets as they passed. Jonah filmed it all, the lens capturing a world that had turned itself inside out under the weight of too many rainless days. By the time they reached the head of the wash, the sun had climbed higher, sharpening every hard edge of rock. Jack parked the truck on a flat spot just above the gully. From here, the land sloped down into a narrow ribbon of shadow where the dry channel cut its way through the earth. He killed the engine. For a moment, the sudden silence rang in their ears. "We go on foot from here," he said. "2 rules. We stay where we can see each other, and we don't do anything stupid." "Define stupid," Riley said. "Anything that gets us or her hurt," Jack answered. "Jonah, you stay a little higher on the lip. Film, but if I tell you to move, you move. No questions." Jonah nodded, face serious now. "Got it." They slid down the loose slope, boots sending small avalanches of dust ahead of them. The air felt different at the bottom, heavier, close, as if the heat had sunk here and decided to stay. The wash wound between low banks. Its floor a mix of fine powder and larger stones polished by water that no longer came. And then they saw her. Aurora lay in a shallow hollow where the wash widened slightly, her tawny body almost blending with the earth. If not for the rise and fall of her flanks, shallow, uneven, you might have taken her for another carcass. Her ribs showed starkly, each one like a finger pressing against her skin from the inside. Flies buzzed lazily around her muzzle and eyes. Under her foreleg, pressed tight against her belly, 2 small shapes shifted. One cub's ear flicked. The other gave a feeble kick, then stilled. Their fur, still fuzzy with youth, looked dulled by dust. Jonah sucked in a breath and lifted his camera. The lens trembled for a moment, then steadied as he focused. "Stay back," Riley said, laying a hand on his arm. "We don't know what she's got left in the tank." Jack stepped forward until he could see her face clearly. Her eyes were half open, the amber dulled, but not gone. As his shadow touched the edge of her, one ear twitched. He saw the effort as she tried to turn her head, the way her neck muscles strained and failed. "God," he whispered, "you've been lying here the whole time." He forced himself to look around, not just at her. The hollow was surrounded by low shrubs and the humped forms of old tree roots. On one side, something glinted faintly in the dust. Jack moved closer and crouched. It was a loop of wire, half buried, rusted and twisted, anchored to a stake driven deep into the ground. One end curled back toward the hollow like a snake's tongue. "Snare," he said tightly. "Old one. Somebody set this a long time ago." Riley joined him, squinting. Could have been some poacher before this was a reserve, or some ranch hand who got tired of coyotes. Either way, it's illegal now. Jack traced the loop's path with his eyes. It had been disturbed not long ago. The dust showed drag marks, a faint groove leading toward Aurora's hollow, then veering off. Maybe she had stepped into it and yanked free. Maybe it had caught long enough to twist a leg, slow her down, send her here more exhausted than she would have been. "Add it to the report," Riley said. "But it doesn't change what we're seeing right now. She's done, Jack. You know it. I know it. Those cubs, they're hanging on, but without milk, they're as good as—" "Don't," Jack cut in. "Not yet." He stood and took a slow step closer. Aurora's eyes found him, hazy but fixed. Her foreleg tightened over the cubs, pulling them closer, a reflex as old as her kind. A sound came from her throat, rough and thin, the ghost of a growl. Riley's hand slid to the tranquilizer rifle slung over his shoulder. "You're inside 20 feet now." "Yeah," Jack said quietly. "I remember the training manual." He felt that old familiar friction in his chest, the rub between protocol and the part of him that had always run toward sirens. Somewhere in his memory, a radio crackled with the voice of a fire chief telling him to wait. He could still see the building that hadn't waited with him. He raised his own radio, thumb hovering over the button. "Maya," he said when the static cleared. "We've got eyes on L-003. She's down in the wash. 2 cubs tucked under her. She can barely lift her head. I'm seeing signs of old snare activity nearby, but no active entanglement. She's just empty, dehydrated, starved. If we walk away, they won't see another sunset." Maya's reply came slower than usual, as if the words had to cross through something heavy before they reached him. "You know the protocol, Jack. If there's no injury affecting the broader population we observe, we document. We don't turn apex predators into charity cases." "This isn't a charity case," he said, voice roughening. "This is a mother with 2 cubs in a drought that's half our fault. We fenced them in here, collared them, filmed them for our website. We put her picture on our donations page. You don't get to call her just a data point now." Riley shifted his weight, uneasy. Jonah lowered the camera for a moment, eyes flicking between Jack and the lioness. On the other end of the line, Maya was silent. Jack could almost hear the gears turning, budget reports, board meetings, public opinion, the ever-present fear of someone on social media accusing them of playing God with wildlife. "Jack," she said at last, "if we cross this line, there's no going back. Not with the board, not with the donors, maybe not with the law. You're asking me to put more than 1 life on that wash floor." He looked at Aurora, at the fragile rise and fall of her sides, at the 2 small shapes pressed under her leg. "I'm not asking you to move the world," he said. "I'm asking for 30 minutes. 30 minutes to try. Then you can write whatever report you need to write and talk to whatever lawyer or insurance agent or donor you have to talk to. But if we do nothing, we'll all know exactly why 3 more bodies are lying out here tomorrow." The desert held its breath. The bones in the wash around them glowed pale in the growing light, each one a reminder of what waiting too long looked like. When Maya answered, her voice had changed. "You get 30 minutes, she said slowly. "No more, no guarantees. And Jack, those 30 minutes are on you." He slipped the radio back on his belt and stepped 1 pace closer to the lioness, feeling every tick of his heart like a drum in his ears. Somewhere, unseen beyond the bend in the wash, a small pack of coyotes caught the scent on the wind and began to drift their way, drawn toward the promise of 3 fading lives, and the man who had just decided not to stand aside this time. For a long heartbeat after Maya's voice faded from the radio, nothing moved in the wash but the flies. The desert seemed to lean in, listening to whether the promise would hold. 30 minutes. It didn't sound like much when you said it out loud. Half an episode of a television show. The time it took to sit on hold with a health insurance company, but standing in that dry channel with a dying lioness at his feet and 2 cubs tucked under her leg, it felt like the whole world had just been crammed into half an hour. Jack clipped the radio back on his belt with hands that were steadier than he felt. Riley stared at him, eyebrows pulled tight. "You really going to do this?" the younger ranger asked. "Maya said observe. You heard her." "She also said I get 30 minutes, Jack replied. "She's going to use them to protect her job and this place. I'm going to use them to see if this mother's got a chance." Riley's gaze slid to Aurora. The lioness lay where she was, ribs rising and falling in that shallow, broken rhythm. 1 cub gave a weak kick against her side, like a question that didn't expect an answer. "This is how people end up as a line in a safety report," Riley muttered. "They ignore protocol, They get sentimental, and next thing you know, somebody's widow is trying to figure out how to live on one Social Security check and a life insurance payout that won't stretch as far as the mortgage. Jack looked at him. "You married, son?" "No," Riley admitted, "but I got a mom who still calls me every Sunday to ask if I've signed up for Medicare Part A yet, like I'm 65 instead of 30. She'd like me to stick around long enough to actually need it." "Then help me make sure I walk out of here," Jack said quietly. "You stay back, rifle ready. If she comes at me, you put a dart in her. Fast, center mass, no heroics." Riley swallowed. "You're the one walking into the circle. Hard to avoid heroics from where I'm standing." Above them, Jonah shifted his footing on the lip of the wash, camera pressed to his face. "I'm rolling," he called down softly. "Battery's full, audio's clean." "Good," Jack replied. "You're the witness if this goes sideways, and if it doesn't, maybe some senator or donor watching this over his retirement planning brochure will remember there's more to this place than numbers on a page." He turned back to the Lioness and exhaled slowly. From this distance he could see the dried mud caked around her paws, the way her claws were half unsheathed, as if her body couldn't decide whether to fight or let go. Her whiskers twitched when a fly landed on her nose, but she didn't have the strength to shake it off. "Okay, girl," he murmured, "here's how this is going to go." He walked up the sloping bank and back to the truck. The heat hit him full in the face as he climbed the short distance, like opening an oven door. In the bed of Unit 2, a plastic cooler waited, condensation long gone from its sides. Inside, he had packed the things he wasn't supposed to use without a stack of forms: 2 bottles of electrolyte solution, a couple of small animal feeding bottles, a bag of powdered milk replacer meant for orphaned antelope fawns, and a basic saline setup used often enough on injured deer to justify its place in the budget. This wasn't car insurance or home insurance, he thought, as he pulled the cooler lid open. There was no neat policy to spell out what happened if he took the wrong step. No call center on the other end of a toll-free number promising peace of mind. Just a risk you measured in bones and breath. He mixed one of the bottles quickly, hands moving from habit. Warm water from the thermos, powder stirred until it dissolved. The smell rose up, faintly sweet and odd in the hot air. He grabbed a liter of plain water as well and slid both into a small canvas bag he could wear across his chest. Riley was waiting when he climbed back down into the wash. He eyed the bag. "You really think she's going to let you waltz in there and play nurse?" he asked. "She's not some sick house cat." "No," Jack said. "She's a wild lioness who has spent her whole life figuring out where danger ends and survival begins. I'm going to give her a reason to see me on the survival side." He unbuckled his belt and set his sidearm on a flat rock. Then he shrugged out of his radio harness and laid it next to the pistol. The tranquilizer rifle stayed on Riley's shoulder. "You're going in unarmed," Riley hissed. "That's not bravery, Jack. That's suicide. You want to talk about life insurance? This is how you make sure your policy pays out." "If she sees a gun, it's over before it starts," Jack said. "Predators know what threat looks like. So do prey animals. I'm just trying to look like neither for a few minutes." He shifted the canvas bag so it rested at his hip, hands empty and visible. "Keep the clock," he told Riley. "When 30 minutes are up, you call Maya. If I'm still out there making a fool of myself, you can drag my sorry hide back to the truck." Riley checked his watch. "Time starts now." The first steps always felt the heaviest. Jack moved slowly, placing each boot as if the earth might crack open under him. The wash seemed narrower now, the walls closer, the air thicker. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, steady but loud. Aurora's eyes tracked him as he came. There was no mistaking that now. Whatever haze covered her thoughts, it parted enough to mark his approach. Her foreleg tightened over the cubs again, claws dimpling the thin fur of their backs. One of them squeaked in protest. "Easy," Jack said, his voice the same tone he'd used years ago with scared tenants in smoke-filled stairwells. "I'm not here to take them. I'm just here to see if we can buy you a little more time." He stopped a good 10 feet away, close enough to be in reach if she lunged, far enough that he might, just might, have a sliver of reaction time. Slowly he lowered himself to one knee, then settled all the way down, so he was sitting in the dust, making his body smaller. Above, Jonah moved along the rim to keep his shot, careful not to send rocks sliding. The camera's little red light winked down like a second artificial star. "Riley," Jack called over his shoulder without looking back. "You still with me?" "Yeah," came the reply. "You're at 19 minutes now. Plenty of time to regret this." Jack slipped the bottle of water from the bag. He unscrewed the cap with exaggerated care, tilting it so the sound was small. He took a sip himself first, letting Aurora see the motion, the harmlessness of it. Then he set the bottle upright in the dust between them and nudged it a few inches closer with his fingertips. The lioness's eyes flicked to it, then back to him. Her nostrils flared, catching the faint, impossible scent of moisture in a place that had forgotten it. The breeze shifted. From farther down the wash came a faint rustle, a soft clicking of claws on stone. Jack didn't turn his head, but the hairs on his arms prickled. Coyotes. Maybe 3, maybe 4. They were close enough now to smell what he smelled, the mix of blood, milk, and the thin, metallic tang of a body shutting down. "Company's coming," Riley murmured. "I see shapes, keeping their distance. For now." "Let them wait their turn," Jack said, his gaze never leaving Aurora's. He lifted his hands, palms up, empty, and waited. The seconds ticked by, each one another grain of sand sliding through a glass he couldn't see. Somewhere behind him, Riley's watch kept the count. Somewhere above him, Jonah's camera kept the record. In front of him, the dying lioness lay in the dust, eyes fixed on the man who had stepped willingly into her circle and weighed, with what was left of her strength, what kind of threat he really was. The choice was still coming. He could feel it, as sure as he'd ever felt an oncoming fire. But for the moment, all he could do was sit in the heat, breathe the same dry air, and hope that when the time came, whatever part of her still remembered trust would be stronger than the part that had been taught all its life. To attack. For a few long seconds, nothing moved but the shimmer of heat between them. The bottle of water sat upright in the dust like some small, impossible miracle, its thin plastic side catching the sunlight. Aurora's breath came in ragged pulls, each one a little shallower than the last. The cubs shifted under her foreleg, pressing their faces into the bare skin of her belly, searching for a comfort that had dried up days ago. Jack felt the sweat running down his back, soaking his shirt where the canvas strap lay. He could hear his own pulse in his ears, counting off the moments faster than Riley's watch ever could. There were times in life when you counted in years, mortgages, retirement planning, the slow march toward Medicare eligibility. Then there were days like this when everything that mattered was squeezed into a handful of heartbeats. Aurora's nostrils flared again, tasting the scent of the water between them. Her eyes stayed locked on Jack's face. He could see the calculation there, dimmed by pain, but not gone. Every wild thing was born with a scale inside it, some instinctive way of weighing risk and chance. Right now, he was on one side of hers. Her cubs were on the other. "Easy," he said softly. "You see what I've got. That's all, nothing else." Behind him, a stone clicked against another stone. The faint patter of paws on rock drifted along the wash. Coyotes, no doubt about it now. They were closer, but still holding back, waiting to see if the lioness finished the job of dying or if she had one last fight in her. Riley's voice came low and tight. 15 minutes left, Jack. They're maybe 50 yards out. 4 of them, maybe 5. I can't tell if they're bold or hungry, but I don't like those odds." Jack didn't move his head, just let his eyes flick sideways for a fraction of a second. On the lip of the wash, Jonah shifted his stance, the camera still pressed to his eye. Lens trained on the circle of dust where man and lioness faced each other. He reached slowly into the canvas bag again. Aurora's head lifted half an inch, jaws twitching. Jack paused until she settled, then eased out the small nursing bottle, rubber nipple dark against the hazy light. "You remember this?" he murmured. "First time you saw something like this, you were the one in the crate." He wasn't sure why he said it. Maybe it was for himself as much as for her. He remembered the day years ago when they'd freed her from that concrete pen back east, the way she'd flattened her ears at the sight of people, unsure whether they meant more hurt or something she couldn't name yet. Back then, she'd chosen to step forward into the trailer instead of throwing herself against the fence. It had been a kind of trust, or at least a surrender to possibility. He pulled the cap off the bottle with his teeth and spat it gently into his hand, then set it down beside the water, a little closer this time. The sweet, milky smell drifted toward them, thin but unmistakable. One of the cubs caught it before Aurora did. A tiny nose poked out from under her foreleg, whiskers twitching frantically. A small tongue darted, tasting dust and air and something that didn't belong in this dead, dry place. The cub squirmed, pushing against its mother's ribcage with more force than its size should have allowed. Aurora's claws flexed over them in reflex, digging lightly into their fur. A low sound rose in her chest, a rumble that could have been warning or worry. Her eyes cut from Jack to the bottle, then back to his hands, empty and still in his lap. "If you're going to kill me," Jack said quietly, "you don't need a reason. You've had one since the moment I stepped in here. But if you're not, if there's anything in you that's got room for something else, I'm right here." He felt foolish talking like that to an animal, but he kept going. He talked about simple things, about how the heat felt, about the way the sky looked this morning, about the way people in town were already grumbling over higher home insurance and gas prices while the land itself was burning up under their feet. His voice was steady, a low thread in the heavy air, something to hold. That wasn't fear. Aurora listened. He could tell. Her ears twitched with each word, adjusting like little satellite dishes. The muscles along her shoulders bunched and released, a slow quiver of effort as she tried to decide what she was now, guardian, hunter, victim. Then slowly she began to move. Her foreleg tightened one last time around the cubs, then loosened. The claws that had been dimpling their backs drew in, sinking back into the worn pads of her paw. With a trembling effort, she dragged that leg forward an inch, then another, pulling it away from their small bodies. The motion exposed more of the cubs' sides, their bellies, the soft, vulnerable place where fur gave way to bare skin. Jack held his breath. This was it, the hinge point. Aurora sucked in a harsh, rattling breath and rolled her weight slightly, turning her shoulder so that more of her flank faced him. It was a tiny change in posture, but everything about it spoke a language older than any rule book. She was taking herself between him and the approaching coyotes, and at the same time she was opening a narrow corridor to the cubs. "She's moving," Jonah whispered from above, wonder threading his voice. Jack, she's making room." Riley's grip tightened on the tranquilizer rifle. "Don't you dare lunge," he muttered under his breath, not sure whether he meant the man or the lioness. Very gently, Jack slid his knees a few inches forward, closing some of the distance the way a tide inches up ashore. He reached out, fingers shaking just enough that he could feel it. The nearest cub sniffed wildly, eyes still sealed, and bumped its nose against his knuckles. Its skin was hot and dry under the dust. "Easy, little one," he whispered. "Let's see what we can do." He curled his fingers around the bottle and guided the nipple toward the cub's mouth. Instinct did the rest. The tiny jaws latched on, and the cubs sucked with a sudden, desperate strength, the sound startling in the quiet. Tiny, wet pulls that sounded like hope. Aurora's head jerked at the noise. Her eyes widened, then softened, some tension easing out of her jaw. The other cub began to wriggle as well, drawn by the promise of something, anything, to fill the gnawing emptiness. Jack kept one hand on the bottle and slid the other toward the water, nudging it another inch closer to her massive paw. The plastic brushed her toes. For a second he braced for teeth. Instead, Aurora's muzzle dipped, almost lazily. Her tongue slipped out, coarse and pink, rasping against the rim. She nudged the bottle, spilled a little in the dust, then found the opening and drew in a mouthful. It wasn't much. It might not be enough. But it was more than the desert had given her in days. On the ridge, the coyotes watched, tails low, ears pricked. The sight of the man inside the circle and the lioness still breathing, still willing to drink, held them at bay for now. They would wait, as scavengers always did, for weakness to finish its work or for a mistake to open the door. Down in the wash, Jack could feel the weight of those seconds settling into him, heavy as any life insurance policy he'd ever signed. He knew this moment would not show up on any official form. It would not be listed under coverage or exceptions. But in the quiet calculation of what makes a life worth the troubles and the bills and the years, it counted for more than most people ever got. In the last seconds of her strength, the dying lioness had been given two clear choices. Attack the man who had crossed into her circle, or trust him with the only future she had left. She had moved her paw. She had turned her shoulder. She had let him place hope between her cubs and the dust. Out here, under a sky that still refused to rain, that counted as an answer. By the time the first bottle ran dry, the sun had climbed straight overhead. Heat poured down the walls of the wash like invisible sand, filling every low place until the air itself felt heavy enough to pick up. The cub's sucking slowed, then fell into a steadier rhythm, its tiny body pressed against Jack's hand as if the bottle were the only solid thing in the world. Aurora's breathing had changed. It was still rough, still shallow, but there was a bit more rhythm in it now, a faint steadiness where there had been only ragged grabbing at the air. She took another clumsy drink from the water bottle, spilling half of it in the dust, then licked the wet patch as if she couldn't bear to let any of it go to waste. 10 minutes left, Riley called quietly. Then your 30 are up. Jack didn't answer right away. He shifted the feeding bottle to the other cub, coaxing it to latch. Its tongue worked, the sound small but determined. Only when both mouths had fallen away in drowsy, milk-drunk breaths did he ease back on his heels. He stood slowly, dust sticking to his knees. The coyotes had edged closer, gray shapes flickering at the bend in the wash like bad thoughts. They paced back and forth, heads low, eyes bright. They could smell milk now, and the faint metallic hint of blood and illness that clung to Aurora's fur. Jack picked up the empty bottles and backed away a few steps. Aurora's head lifted a fraction, tracking him, but she didn't try to follow. Her paw lay open beside the cub's now, claws half-sheathed, as if she had made her choice and no longer had the strength to revisit it. He grabbed the radio from the rock where he'd left it and thumbed the button. "Maya," he said, voice hoarse. "You still there?" Static, then her answer. "I'm here. Your 30 minutes are up." "I know," Jack said. He looked at the lioness, at the two small bodies pressed into her side, at the circling coyotes just beyond the bend. "Listen, we've got partial response. She's drinking, a little. Cubs took formula, but she's too weak to move, and we've got scavengers closing in. If we walk away now, we're just saving them for the coyotes' supper." On the other end, a chair creaked. He could almost see Maya pinch the bridge of her nose the way she did when the numbers on a budget spreadsheet didn't add up. "If we bring in a truck," she said carefully, "if we sedate and move her, we're not observing anymore. We're intervening. And the board will ask me, very politely, whether we also plan to step in for every sick lion, every injured coyote, every stressed antelope with a twisted hoof. They'll talk about mission creep and liability and how our insurance carrier feels about staff working that close to predators." "Tell them whatever you need to tell them," Jack answered. "But if you want to look me in the eye for the rest of my contract, you come down this wash with a med kit. If we can't get her up, we stabilize. We make this gully a field hospital for one night. After that, the desert can take over again." There was a long pause. Through the thin speaker, he heard a faint burst of sound. Some radio in Maya's office, playing a commercial about retirement planning, about how folks should sit down with a financial advisor and think about life insurance and long-term care as if the future would always be there to plan for. Out here, a future could disappear between one breath and the next. "All right," Maya said at last. "I'm coming. 10 minutes to load the truck, 20 to get there. Riley, you keep the coyotes honest. Jonah, no streaming, no posting. Everything you've shot stays on that camera until I say otherwise." Jonah's voice floated down from the rim. "Got it, Doc." Riley shifted his stance, bringing the tranquilizer rifle up to his shoulder. "I'll put myself on the menu before I let them touch those cubs," he muttered. "Let's not test that theory," Jack said. "Just keep them scared enough to wait." The next half hour stretched thin. The coyotes paced at the bend, slipping in and out of view, testing the edge of the invisible line that separated curiosity from commitment. Every now and then, one would inch a little closer, shoulders rolling, tail low. Riley would clap, shout, or send a warning shot into the dirt a few yards ahead of them. The crack echoed off the canyon walls and sent them darting back, but never very far. Aurora watched it all with one half-open eye. When the gun went off, she flinched, a tremor running through her wasted muscles, but she didn't try to rise. Her focus kept drifting back to the small, warm weights at her side, to the scent of milk drying on their fur. When the sound of another engine finally reached them, it came like a memory at first, a low hum under the heavy air. Then it grew, the familiar chug and grind of Unit 1 handling a bad road. Dust rose on the ridge. Moments later, Maya appeared at the edge of the wash, her hair pulled back, a duffel bag slung over one narrow shoulder. She took in the scene in one slow sweep. Aurora, the cubs, Jack in the dust, Riley with the rifle, the coyotes holding a jagged line in the distance, Jonah's camera fixed like an unblinking eye. "Well," she said quietly, "you weren't exaggerating." "Didn't think I was," Jack replied. Maya slid down the bank with more grace than he would have expected, the medical bag bouncing lightly against her hip. Up close, the lines around her eyes looked deeper than they had last year. Drought did that to people as well as land. "She's in bad shape," Maya murmured, crouching just out of reach of Aurora's paws. "Dehydrated, underweight, probably hasn't had a full drink of water in days. Hard to know if there's organ damage without labs." She glanced up at Jack. "You really got her to drink?" "Water and a little milk replace her for the cubs," he said. "She didn't like me at first." "No reason she should," Maya said. "You look like every problem she's ever had, rolled into one." She reached into the bag and pulled out a small saline pack and a set of long needles and tubing. "We can give subcutaneous fluids," she said. "Low dose, slow drip. It won't fix everything, but it might buy her body a few more hours to remember how to fight. You keep her attention. If she takes her eyes off you and puts them on me, I want you out of range before she remembers what teeth are for." Jack moved a little, putting himself where Aurora could see him clearly. He sat back down in the dust, legs folded, voice low and steady. He talked about nothing and everything, the heat, the sky, the way the creek used to run in the spring. He told her about the first time he'd seen her hunt, how clean and sure her movements had been. He told her about people back in town arguing over health insurance premiums and grocery bills, never knowing that just an hour's drive away, there was a lioness spending the last of her strength on two small lives. While he talked, Maya worked. Her hands were quick and careful, sliding the needle just under Aurora's loose skin, taping the line in place with strips that clung despite the dust. Aurora's muscles twitched at the prick, but she didn't lash out. Her gaze stayed fixed on Jack, as if she'd decided that if anything in this gully was going to kill her, it would be this man, not the quiet woman behind her shoulder. The fluid bag hung from a makeshift stand, a forked branch driven into the ground, a strip of gauze looped around it. The clear liquid began to drain slowly, drop by drop, into the lioness's body. The sun sank as they worked. Shadows lengthened, filling the wash with a cooler kind of darkness. The coyotes drifted farther back, then closer again, their patience thinning as the light did. One sat down on its haunches and lifted its nose, tasting the air. Another gave a short, sharp bark, a question in predator's language. "We can't move her tonight," Maya said finally, sitting back on her heels. "Even if we had a sling and 4 more people, the stress would probably kill her. The cubs, too. We stabilize as best we can, and we hold this ground until morning." "How?" Riley asked. "We going to put up a sign that says, 'No scavengers allowed'? They're going to keep testing us." "We camp," Jack said, "right here, in shifts. One awake at all times. Rifle ready. Headlights angled down the wash. We've all pulled worse overnights." Maya shot him a look that was half exasperation, half reluctant agreement. "You're not 25 anymore, Jack." "No," he said, "but I'm not dead yet, either." She sighed, then nodded. "All right. Jonah, get what you need from the truck. Sleeping bags, lanterns, extra batteries. Riley, set the truck so the beams cover as much of the wash as possible without blinding us. If the coyotes decide to rush us, I want them lit up like a Sunday parade." As the last light drained from the sky, they built a small circle of human presence around the lioness and her cubs. A lantern hung from the same branch that held the fluid bag, casting a yellow glow over Aurora's fur. The truck's headlights carved sharp shadows down the wash. The air cooled, but not enough to be kind. Jack took first watch. He sat with his back against the truck tire, rifle within reach, but not in his hands, eyes on the bend where the coyotes moved like smoke. Maya lay down on a thin sleeping pad a few yards away, one arm under her head, the other resting lightly on her medical bag. Jonah fell into an exhausted sleep almost as soon as he closed his eyes. Riley snored in short, anxious bursts. Every so often, a coyote would edge forward into the light, eyes shining green. Jack would stand, clap his hands, and step toward it, shoulders squared. Predators recognized confidence and distance. They also recognized uncertainty, and he didn't dare show them any. Hours crawled past. The night sounds rose and fell, the occasional hoot of an owl, the whisper of a breeze that never made it all the way to cool. Above them, the stars spread out in such numbers it hurt to look at them. Somewhere in town, an ad on late-night television was reminding someone's grandmother to review her Medicare plan options during open enrollment. Out here, the only plan that mattered was to see morning. Around midnight, Aurora stirred. Jack watched as she lifted her head a little higher than she had in days, nostrils flaring. The cubs wriggled and pushed closer, one of them climbing halfway up her side before sliding back down. For a moment, he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a faint, stubborn spark. "Still with us, girl," he murmured. "That's it. You hang on. We'll hang on." She drew in a long breath and let it out in a sigh that seemed to empty the whole canyon. Then she lowered her head again, this time with a little less collapse in the motion, as if she were choosing to rest instead of being forced down. Jack shifted, stretching his legs. His back ached, and his eyelids felt heavy, but he stayed where he was. He thought of all the nights he'd spent awake for the sake of people who would never know his name, the fires he'd watched crawl across ceilings, the stairwells he'd climbed while others went the other way. This night felt different, smaller in some ways. It was just one gully, one lioness, 2 cubs, a handful of coyotes, and a circle of tired humans. But as the hours ticked by and the desert kept its many secrets, he had the quiet, stubborn sense that something more was happening here than could fit in a field report. That somewhere down the line, in ways none of them could see yet, this night, this choice to stay, to fight, to trust, would reach farther than the beam of their headlights. He settled his shoulders against the tire, adjusted the rifle so it lay where his hand could find it in an instant, and kept his eyes on the darkness just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for the first hint of dawn. Morning didn't so much arrive in Red Canyon as seep in, gray and cautious, as if the sky wasn't quite sure it wanted to try again. Jack felt it before he saw it, the air thinning a little, the stars fading overhead, the coyotes slipping back like bad dreams at first light. His back ached from the hours against the truck tire. When he pushed himself up onto stiff knees, the wash around him looked softer than it had in the hard beam of the headlights. Aurora lay where she had all night, but something in the way she held herself had shifted. Her head wasn't flat on the ground anymore. It was lifted a few inches, just enough that her chin cleared the dust. The cubs were a tangle of paws and tails at her side, their bellies round under the thin fur, sleep-heavy from formula and exhaustion. One of them yawned, showing a tiny pink mouth and teeth just beginning to grow in. It kicked lazily against its mother's ribs. Maya stirred on her sleeping pad, rubbing grit from her eyes. She sat up slowly, glanced at the fluid bag, then at the lioness. For the first time since she'd slid down into the wash the day before, Jack saw the faintest of smiles cross her face. "Well, look at that," she murmured. "She's decided to stick around a little longer." Aurora blinked at them, slow and deliberate. Her nostrils flared, testing the coolness in the air. There was the faintest suggestion of a breeze, and with it came something none of them had smelled in weeks, a hint of moisture, so thin you could have called it wishful thinking if you didn't know this land as they did. Riley rolled over and sat up, running a hand through his hair. "I'll be damned," he said softly. "She looks less dead." "That's the medical term, is it?" Maya said. "Less dead." "It'll do for today," Jack added. They didn't try to move Aurora that morning. They let the fluids finish their slow drip. They fed, the cubs again careful to keep their hands gentle and their movements predictable. When they did finally back away and climb out of the wash, leaving Aurora and her cubs in the shallow hollow, the lioness lifted her head another inch, watching them go with eyes that were tired, but no longer quite so clouded. The days that followed blurred into a kind of rough, hopeful routine. At dawn and dusk, they came with water and formula, always stopping at the edge of the wash to let Aurora see them, smell them, decide. Each time, she tensed a little less. Each time, her head lifted a little higher. By the end of the week, she was pulling herself into a sitting position when they arrived, the cubs swarming over her like clumsy shadows. The coyotes kept their distance now, too smart to push against a circle of humans who had proven willing to stay the night. They haunted the edges of the canyon instead, looking for easier meals. On the 9th day, the sky finally broke. It started as a smear of cloud over the far mesas, dark and heavy-looking in a way no cloud had been in months. Jack watched it from the ridge above the wash, arms folded, the smell of dust and old rain stirring memories he hadn't expected. Muddy boots in another life, thunderstorms over city rooftops, nights when he'd stood under an awning and thanked the sky for putting out a fire he couldn't. The first drop hit his cheek like a finger tap. The second landed on the back of his hand. Then the air was full of it, cool beads that turned to streams, darkening the red dust, sliding down the rock face in shining veins. In the wash below, Aurora lifted her head, eyes wide. The cubs flinched at the strange sensation, then began to paw at the wet earth with delighted confusion. Jack and Riley stood there in the rain without moving. Maya laughed out loud, a sharp surprise sound, like someone who'd just opened a letter and found out their health insurance premium had gone down instead of up for once in their life. Jonah filmed, the camera lens freckled with drops. The drought wasn't over in a day. That's not how it works. But the creek bed stopped looking quite so much like a scar. The holding ponds collected puddles that grew into pools. The soil loosened its grip on the roots of things. Grass, thin and stubborn, began to show in patches like a lime-green rash across the brown. Aurora did her healing in the same slow way. One week she was standing shaky on all fours, the cubs weaving between her legs. Another week she took a few unsteady steps down the wash. By the time a full month had gone by, she could climb out of the gully on her own, leaning into a trot that had a ghost of her old power in it. They didn't try to keep her close after that. The point had never been to turn her into a zoo animal on a payment plan, as Jack liked to put it. The point had been to give her the chance to choose again, to let her decide whether to live like a lioness or die like a statistic in a conservation report. She chose the first. They still watched, of course. The GPS collar sent its steady pulse across the board in Maya's office. Now, when Jack tracked her, the dot moved. It roamed farther each day, tracing paths across the rejuvenating reserve. The cubs' signals joined hers when they were old enough to wear their own collars, just for a while, long enough to study how they learned this place. One morning, a few weeks after the first rain, Jack walked out to a familiar ridge with a thermos of coffee in his hand. The air was cool, the kind of morning that made a man think about simple things. Warm socks, a steady pension, the quiet comfort of having your car insurance and home insurance paid up so your kids didn't have to worry if some storm or wildfire came through. He stopped when he saw her. Aurora was already there in the wash below, standing over something dark in the dust. As he watched, she bent her head and dragged it farther, muscles shifting under her hide. It wasn't pretty. Nothing about feeding was, up close, but there was a rightness to the scene that made him stay where he was. Then she did something that had no place in any textbook. Instead of dragging the carcass back the way she'd come, she turned and pulled it toward the low slope where Jack usually climbed down. It was a young feral hog, small but heavy. She hauled it to a stop at the base of the incline, right where his boot prints so often scarred the dust. Then she stepped back and looked up. Their eyes met across the few yards of hot air. Jack felt that same old prickle under his skin, the one that started the day he stepped into her killing radius. He took one step down, then another, stopping where he knew the invisible line lay. Aurora didn't growl. She didn't lower her head in threat. She simply stood there between the cubs and the gift she'd brought, as if waiting to see what he would do. "I don't am raw hog," he said quietly, not even to be polite. But he understood. In her world, food was everything. You shared it with your pride, with those you trusted to give something back. This was more than a meal. It was an oath, laid in dust and blood. He put his hand over his heart instead, then lifted it a few inches in what might have been a wave and might have been a salute. Aurora watched the motion, then turned, flicked her tail, and led the cubs away, leaving the hog where it lay. Word of what had happened in that wash spread slowly at first, through staff meetings, quiet conversations with board members, a few careful photos and clips in internal reports. Then Jonah's footage began to make its way out into the world. Edited, narrated, wrapped in context, it appeared not as a dramatic stunt, but as a hard, honest look at what it meant to work where wild lives and human decisions collided. It's funny how people respond when they see something real. Donors who had been on the fence about renewing their support called to say they'd watched the video with their grandchildren and wanted to help keep the reserve open. A retired insurance adjuster wrote a letter saying he'd spent 40 years calculating the cost of accidents and never understood the value of a second until he saw a lioness move her paw. One man, a financial advisor from back east, sent a check with a note that read, "I spend my days talking to folks about life insurance and retirement planning as if we're guaranteed all the time in the world. Your lioness reminded me we're not. Use this to buy more time for places like hers." The board, faced with numbers on the page and eyes on the story, did what boards sometimes do when they realize the world is watching. They kept the funding. They tightened some language in the protocols, clarified when intervention could be considered. They did not, in the end, shut down the reserve or fire the people who had spent a long night lining a wash with headlights and hope. 2 years slipped by. Red Canyon changed, and didn't. There were still dry spells that made everyone look at the sky a little too often. There were still arguments over budgets and staff and what could and couldn't be done, but there was grass now where there had been only bone. The creek ran most springs, and somewhere in that patchwork of rock and green, a lioness and her now almost grown cubs hunted along old paths and knew. On a late afternoon in early fall, Jonah came back with a proper crew and funding for a full documentary. He was older by a few lines around the eyes, but his enthusiasm hadn't worn out. Jack rode with him in a jeep to the same ridge above the South Wash, the engine quieting as they rolled to a stop. "Signal says they're close," Jonah said, checking the collar data on a tablet. "Couple 100 yards that way." He pointed toward a fold in the land where the light lay soft and gold. They stepped out into the familiar dust. The air was cooler now, the sun already leaning west. Down below, in a dip near the edge of the scrub, movement caught Jack's eye. A small herd of deer grazed nervously, ears flicking. Beyond them, half hidden in shadow, a shape flowed between rocks, tawny, low, deliberate. Aurora. Her body was fuller now, the ribs less visible, but the scar along her left flank was the same. 2 younger lions flanked her, moving with the lanky grace of teenagers who hadn't quite grown into their power. Jack lifted the binoculars Jonah handed him. Through the glass, the scene sharpened. He watched as Aurora signaled with the tilt of her head, sending one youngster around to the left, the other to the right. The deer grazed, unaware that their small, ordinary lives were moments away from ending or changing. The young lions crept, muscles bunching, tails stiff. Then, in the kind of moment no script writer could have designed, Aurora paused. She lifted her head, not toward the deer, not toward the cover ahead, toward the ridge, toward the spot, where 2 figures stood side by side, the glass of binoculars glinting faintly. For a long breath, she looked straight at them. Jack felt it again, that anchoring, that strange, measured connection. He didn't know what she saw when she looked up there. A shape, a scent remembered on some level deeper than thought, the echo of a night when headlights turned a wash into a sanctuary. Whatever it was, it held her. He lowered the binoculars. He didn't lift his hand this time. He didn't call out. He simply stood there, like any old man might stand on his own back porch, watching the world he loved go on about its business. After a moment, Aurora blinked. She turned her head back to the deer and flowed forward, all attention on the work at hand. The young lions took their cues from her, the hunt resuming as if nothing had interrupted it. Beside Jack, Jonah let out a slow breath. "You think she knows you?" he asked. Jack thought about it, about the seconds in that wash, about the way she'd shifted her paw, turned her shoulder, let him close, about the years since, the rains and the dry spells, the cubs growing strong. "I don't know," he said. "I don't think it matters what I call it. Whatever it is, it was enough that day." The camera rolled as the lions moved, as the deer scattered, as dust rose and settled again. Out here, nothing stayed still for long. Not the weather, not the rules, not the lives that crossed paths and changed each other without meaning to. Later, when people sat in living rooms across the country, checking their mail and worrying over health insurance premiums and property taxes and all the ordinary burdens of aging, some of them would turn on a screen and see the story of a lioness in a drought-stricken canyon. They would see the moment she had only seconds to choose: attack the man in front of her or trust him with her cubs. They would watch her move her paw and understand, in some quiet place inside, that not all power in this world comes from teeth or money or signatures on a form. Sometimes it comes from the simple, terrible, beautiful act of choosing trust when fear would be easier. In a desert that had forgotten the rain, a dying lioness once had seconds to decide who she was: a killer or a mother willing to gamble everything on a stranger who stepped into her circle. Those few heartbeats did more than save 2 cubs. They rewrote the story of a man, a canyon, a reserve full of watching eyes, and every rule any of them thought they understood about wild hearts. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this: do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.